All right, Jay, you ready? All right. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you this morning. And welcome to our first PBS after our 175th anniversary. You are the first Pastor's Bible Study of our next 175 years. So you consider yourselves charter members at this point. It's so good to have everybody here. I want to thank Jay, first of all, before he runs out. We want to thank him for all the music and the choir and Jay did beautiful pieces by themselves. I thought it was wonderful when you and he and Callan worked so well together to kind of blend the traditional and the contemporary, and all that was just absolutely wonderful. And so thank you all for being a part of that 175th weekend. It was just really, really special. It doesn't end though. We have not just a new year, but a new hymnal. And for those of you who don't know, we're actually going to be dedicating our new hymnal this Sunday. People have been wondering, why haven't we put the hymnals back in the pews yet? Or it's not just because we haven't done it. It's because way before the pandemic, the session had adopted a new hymnal, but then COVID hit, and we decided, well, let's not roll it out in the middle of whatever this is. Let's have a time to celebrate that, because when you think about it, I mean, that the old hymnal was 1955. So somebody do the math. Was that like 76 years? I mean, whatever it is, that's, I mean, my relationship with that red hymnal is longer than my relationship with my wife. I mean, so it's, we want to honor that. That's exciting. But as we enter into this new phase, one of the cool things about this new hymnal is it's got our old tried and true favorites, plus some brand new songs, including "Great Is Thy Faithfulness," "How Great Thou Art," brand new, cutting edge, avant-garde hymnody I guess that were written way back in the ancient times of like 1956 as opposed to 55. So there's some great stuff in there, as well as some world hymnody and some other great stuff. But it's really it's not just about a new hymn book. I mean, a new hymn book is wonderful, but it's more about it's more about honoring how we use music, how we just stand in that tradition. If you are not already planning on being there, or if you haven't already been, actually the first session was last night. Dr. Tripp Stewart is doing a fantastic survey and course right now on the hymns of Christmas, and he actually started that last night. This is kind of following up on the art and architecture of the church that Stuart Seal did. He began that last night. It will be recorded, but it's so much better in person. But what he did last night was he gave us a fantastic overview of the development of music in the church and of worship. Of course, beginning with the ancient synagogue and moving through about the Middle Ages till the advent of what we would kind of call modern music, which was kind of classical music. And Jade knows all this, so correct me if I speak out of school, but it was fascinating to hear, to be talking about music, before there were innovations like a staff or harmony or things like that. Just the old ways, the way that music developed. And one of the things that we were talking about in our Thursday morning Bible study is that as long as there has been worship, there have been controversies about the type of music that were used. I mean, one of the things that Chip was talking about was when there was a controversy among the churches, among the popes and bishops, about whether or not this new kind of music was appropriate for worship. And what they were talking about was harmony. It's kind of like nowadays when you say, well, I just don't like that new kind of worship music or something like that. Remember, we're not the first people to argue about that. There was a time when somebody like Jay, who played an organ, would have been considered a rock star by some and a heretic by others. And so we are glad that he's here, and we're glad that those things are not controversial anymore. But my ancestors from the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church left the main line of the Presbyterian Church because the main line had become far too liberal in its worship. the controversy. The Southern Presbyterian Church or the mainline Presbyterian Church decided to start singing hymns instead of just psalms exclusively. In the appropriation of my Associate Reformed Presbyterian ancestors, that made you a wild-eyed liberal if you sang something other than the Psalter. And so that that denomination still exists. They have lightened up a little bit. But in any event, so there's a lot there. Yeah, Chuck. Oh, these will still be here. We'll still be using these. And, with regard to the old hymn books, people have said, will those be available? Will we be giving those away or selling them? Yes, but there's a minimum. You have to take 20 with you because we've got a lot of them. And they have, like I said, they have served their purposes well. So, but this Sunday it's going to be fun. We're going to be meeting for all of our services in the sanctuary, introducing the new hymnal, dedicating those as a wonderful new worship resource. And so we hope that you'll be there for that. But this morning we're going to honor that time of singing by singing hymn number 64. This is one of my favorite hymns. It is, I believe that according to tradition, John Calvin actually wrote these words, "For guide me thou, O great Jehovah." And I hope you were listening, because in case you didn't notice, Jay was just playing this, but in a slightly different mode. So let's sing together hymn number 64, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah." Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, let's come together with you today. Let us come into your presence, and we ask you to be present with us. Let us join together in worship, and let us read together your word. And Lord, help us most of all not only to hear, but to heed your voice. May the words that we read today, the stories that we hear, and the thoughts they conjure convict us more and more of your righteousness, your mercy, and your authority. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So, what is your price? What is your price? One of my good friends and mentors, Dr. Bill Wood, used to like telling me about a time when he was actually he was the pastor of a church in Kingsport, Tennessee, and he was, for those who don't remember Bill was actually the associate pastor of this church many years ago. He was Louis Abendon's first associate pastor, was my mentor and friend, the pastor who ordained me in Charlotte, North Carolina. But when he was in Kingsport, Tennessee, He was pretty well connected in the Presbyterian Church. He was starting to be fairly well known, and there were several occasions when different pastor nominating committees, different pulpit committees would come, and they would come and offer him opportunities to move to other churches. And there was one time when he was being courted by a church that was very attractive in a lot of different ways, a church down in Atlanta, and they just kept coming and they kept coming, and he just got prayed about it, and he felt convicted that he was not supposed to leave Kingsport. He just did not feel that this was the time, that this was the season, or that this was the church. And they kept coming to him, and so much so. They did not. He politely turned them away, and then he more sternly turned them away, and then he finally just begged them to leave him alone. And they said, "Well, Dr. Wood, what is the problem? Are we just not?" Because they kept raising the offer. He said, "What is the problem? Are we just not in the ballpark?" He says, "No, the problem is you're in the ballpark, and you're getting closer and closer. And if you keep coming, I'm scared that you're going to find out what my price is, and I don't want to be in that position." He said, "I don't want this, like, you should sort of get thee behind me, Satan. I don't want to know what my price is, because you just keep coming and you keep raising this offer, and I feel like God's telling me to stay, and I don't want to be disobedient." Well, that's a challenge all of us face, whether it's a temptation or a threat. We are all challenged to find at some point and face in the mirror at some point in our lives what my price is. What is that threshold where the temptation becomes too great or the threat becomes too great to push me into disobeying God, or turning against my conscience, or betraying a friend, or whatever the situation is, whatever that sin is that line is that we don't want to cross. We will be pushed and tempted. That's what we see. That's why Satan tempted Jesus 3 different times in 3 different ways. He was trying to say, all right, does the Son of God have a price? Does God himself have a price? That he will, which is ridiculous with God, because he already owns everything. There's nothing that he doesn't have. There's nothing he doesn't have. And so there is no price. But, for us, we're not quite in that situation. Well, today we're going to be talking about a man named Balaam, who found, or whose price was, in a sense, discovered. And so we're gonna talk about that. This is, again, one of those fascinating stories in the book of Numbers that unfortunately, when people blow over Numbers, they just miss. And yet the story of Balaam and the figure of Balaam is one whose reach goes way beyond the book of Numbers. Again, this, if you read Numbers in isolation, you think, oh, wow, this is, this story of Balaam. Well, it's an interesting little story, maybe even a kid's Sunday school story, until you realize the fallout from the events covered in the story, and you realize just how far-reaching those were. I believe at the top of your outline today, I included a passage from Micah, chapter 6. "O my people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me, for I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, devised, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord." Here's God in the book of Micah, centuries later, using as a reference the story of Balaam to make a point to the people. He shows up in the Old Testament. He shows up in the New Testament. He shows up in the book of Revelation. All these places. This is one of those figures that you need to know. You need to know his story so that you can understand more deeply the places where he is referenced. It's kind of like last week when we were talking about John 3:16. How much more do you feel like you have a better understanding of John 3:16 now that you know the story of Moses and the snake? Moses and the snake. I'm sorry, I'm hungry. Moses and the snake. Yeah. I mean, and I think that you really don't understand John 3:16 properly until we understand that context. Same thing with Balaam. Another one of those flyover stories that if we don't understand it, we're going to miss a lot of the richness, not only of the Old Testament, but of the New Testament. So let's consider what's going on. Of course, they were in the wilderness, but as they were in the wilderness, excuse me, let me hook up my, got all my technology, and I don't have all my technology together. Here we go. Let's see. There we go. So they're in the wilderness again. They have been in the wilderness now for decades, and they're getting ready to make that move into the promised land. And what we read at the beginning of this story, and as we've concluded the last story, we see that Israel, thanks to the Lord, thanks to his guidance, his power, his provision, Israel is beginning to have just a series of military successes. I mean, we first see that they defeat the Canaanite king Arad. He attacks Israel, and Israel wins decisively. And it's after that victory then that we have the fiery serpent ordeal. It was after the defeat of the Canaanites of Arad that the Israelites doubt again. They start complaining again, and that's when the whole fiery serpent episode takes place. But then they get back on track, and they have the war with the Amorites. King Sihon will not let Israel pass through his land. He doesn't give them airspace rights to conduct operations. He won't let them pass through. They said, we won't bother you. This is not the land we've come to conquer. We just want to pass through. And King Sihon says, no. I'm not going to have that. You're not walking through my land. I know what's going to really happen. You're going to come in. I'm going to let you in, and you're going to just ransack the place. So he wouldn't let them pass through. And so Israel is not going to be deterred, and they do exactly what Sihon feared they would do. They attack and they take over. And then you have Bashan, King Og. He, in a sort of preventative retaliatory idea, decides to attack Israel, and Israel destroys King Og and the people of Bashan completely. No survivors, and they take possession of the land. And so you have these three huge military victories. A couple of them defensive, a couple of them offensive. But again, God is showing that He is going to not only protect Israel, but He is going to make Israel victorious. Later in the chapter we read today, we see that He is called the horns of the bull of Israel. Y'all know the old expression, if you mess with the bull, you're going to get the horns. Well, you mess with Israel, you're going to get the horns of Israel, which is God. And He says, and so He is now cementing the fact that, what He started in Egypt, He is going to continue into Canaan. And so we have this, this series of victories. Now, this is making every other political entity in the region nervous. Matter of fact, terrified, fearful. They are on the move. The Israelites are on the move. And Israel arrives at the plains of Moab, where they decide to make camp. Now, here's what happens. Balak is the king of Moab. And Balak is terrified of Israel. Listen to what it says in chapter 22, beginning of verse 2. And Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. So again, he's gotten word. His scouts have reported. The news is in. CNN's running this 24/7 about what the Israelites have done in these previous contests. And Moab was in great dread of the people because there were many. And Moab, when it says when he was in great dread of the people, he's talking about the Israelites here. There are two words to describe all humanity. The La'am, which is the people, and the Goyim, which is the outside, or the Gentiles. And so when they say the people, they're talking specifically about the people of Israel. And so Moab was overcome with fear of the people of Israel. And Moab said to the elders of Midian, "This horde will now lick up all that is around us as the ox licks up the grass of the field." I mean, I find it fascinating that he refers to them as the horde. I mean, who do we refer to historically as like the horde? Like the Huns, the Mongols. I mean, Nobody beats a horde. I mean, zombie literature and movies and, kind of all that dystopian sort of sci-fi stuff. It is all about the idea of being overrun by a horde. I mean, this was the great fear of Rome. The great fear of Rome was that one day they would be overrun by barbarian hordes. And that's why that was the context of St. Augustine's great work, The City of God. I can't remember which set of barbarians it was. I think it was the Visigoths had just ransacked Rome, and it was just the calamity of calamities. And it was. I mean, they didn't come in happy. They've been oppressed for many years, and they were there for some comeuppance. But the whole idea that you would have this horde of people, this swarm of locusts, this mass of enemies coming that was just overwhelming like the tide. I mean, think of it, if you've been to the beach and you've built a sandcastle, you know that that's not going to last. Why? Because eventually the tide is going to just wipe it out and erase all memory of it. Well, this is what Balak feared, is that you have this huge number of people, this mighty tribe that appears to be backed by the power of God. Or the power of some God. We don't know who it is, but apparently this God is here to do business. And so he is terrified. He says that this people, this horde, will now lick up all that is around us as an ox licks up now the grass of the field. So Balak did what any leader would do. He tried to figure out a way to defend his people. And he realized that this was not conventional warfare. The Israelites had some kind of secret weapon. And, we would look at it these days that, they had a nuclear capability. And we just have conventional warfare. Well, we have to remember in those days when the supernatural was much more palpable, Balak saw that they had a supernatural secret weapon in the power of God that his armies and no other army could stand against. And so Balak says, I don't know what to do. My armies, as skilled, as dedicated, as loyal, as numerous as they are, they can't be this because we're fighting a conventional war against a nuclear power. We're going to have to go nuclear. We're going to have to go supernatural. And so what did he do? Balak decided that he would get himself a nuclear weapon. And that nuclear weapon's name was Balaam. He decided to go supernatural, and Balak decided to hire a wizard, called various other places a prophet, a wizard named Balaam. Now, Balaam was a man at this point already of international renown and reputation. He had a reputation as a diviner, that is kind of a fortune teller, somebody who literally read the tea leaves and kind of saw things people didn't see. As a prophet, someone who spoke to God, or at least the gods, as a holy man, and as a sorcerer, someone who could command supernatural powers. He lived in Pethor, which is in northern Syria, near the river Euphrates. So he had sort of this ancient connection, ancient lineage to these ancient superpowers like Babylon and Assyria and Ur and the Sumerians and all those. And Balaam was, he was just one of these people who had that reputation as a person who had a power to get things done. And it's interesting that Balaam was a historical figure. He's not just mentioned in the Bible. He's also mentioned prominently in an 8th century BC inscription found at a site called Deir Allah in Jordan. The Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary says that in the middle of the destruction debris of this tell, Deir Allah, large and small fragments of a fallen wall, plaster from that wall, were found containing a beautifully written Aramaic text relating the seer Balaam of Beor, who witnessed a meeting of gods trying to prevent a goddess from punishing the human race by destruction. In the first millennium BC, he was apparently remembered as a great religious authority in the Jordan area. So there is extra-canonical, extra-biblical archaeological evidence that refers to Balaam. Whenever you hear, just sideline, Whenever you watch the Discovery Channel or the non-science channel or the non-history channel or any of those things, and they start talking about how archaeology has disproven so much of the Bible that there's no archaeological evidence, what they're doing is they are using archaeological evidence and the state of archaeology from about 150 to 200 years ago. What happens in archaeology when you keep digging? You start finding new stuff, right? Well, guess what? They've kept digging, and a lot of that archaeological evidence that the skeptics of the German schools and the European liberal schools base their evidence on has now been disproven because they did what archaeologists do. They kept digging. And so now you have not just in this case, but you have lots of other bits of evidence that are now coming to light, showing, oh, well, these kings like David did exist. These kings these prophets like Balaam were known. You had all these, you have all these things that keep coming up. And so that's, so this, he was a historical figure. But from conventional warfare to spiritual warfare, Balak wanted to hire Balaam essentially as a spiritual mercenary to curse Israel. In other words, I don't have any nukes. He's got a nuke. I'm going to go get him. He thought he could bring some parity to this conflict. So Balak sent men to negotiate with Balaam. Now, Balaam received these emissaries, but he wouldn't give them an answer to their questions until he had spoken to the Lord. Basically, Balak sent what are called the princes of Moab to him. He sent these noblemen with tons and tons of cash. Said, we will not only give you money, we will give you titles. We'll give you hereditary title in the kingdom of Moab if you will come and curse Israel. I mean, this is not just if you'll come and tell us how to lay out our battle plan. We want you to actually launch a spiritual, supernatural attack, calling on all of your demon, angel, godlike, demigod friends to come and attack Israel. This is what they wanted from him. But Balaam says, no, wait a minute. You don't understand. That's not how it works. I'm not just a wizard for hire. I need to check with my allies. I want to see if they're into this. I want to see if if I'm going to call on these heavenly powers to nuke Israel, then I want to make sure that they're behind this too. And why would he do that? I mean, again, he really believed this stuff. I don't think he was necessarily a charlatan. He believed that if I go out there and I curse Israel and nothing happens, well, all of a sudden his reputation's shot. So he's got to check. He's got to read his tea leaves. He's got to check his crystal ball. He's got to pull out his Ouija board. He might even pray. Might make a sacrifice or two, but he's going to consult these gods. And he says, in particular, this God that calls himself Yahweh, this God of the Israelites, I better check with him. I'll see what happens here with him. And here's the amazing thing. He says, I'm not going to answer until I've spoken to the Lord. If you look in your Bible, it's translated, or it's rendered as capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, which is the signal in English Bibles that what is translated here is the proper name of God, I am, or Yahweh, Jehovah. So what's fascinating is that Balaam knows the name of the Hebrew God. He knows his reputation and apparently has some kind of relationship with him. Check this out, because it says, is it legitimate to call Balaam a prophet? Yes. He's not a good prophet, as we're going to see, but he is a prophet. And how do we know that? Because God spoke to him. God spoke to him. Balaam is a legitimate prophet in the sense that God spoke directly to them. Apparently, his reputation was not without some merit. So look at verse 10. And Balaam said to God, Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent to me, saying, Behold, a people has come out of Egypt, and it covers the face of the earth. Now come, curse them for me. Perhaps I shall be able to fight against them and drive them out. And then God said to Balaam, you shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. For they are blessed. So Balaam's thinking, that was a close one. This is a God who has leveled the most powerful empire on earth, and if I had taken this contract, I'd be in serious trouble. So Balaam obeys God and refuses to go and curse Israel. He says, thank you, but no thank you. Your money, your titles, that's just not enough for me. Balaam rose in the morning and said to the princes of Balak, go to your own land, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you. So the princes of Moab rose and went to Balak and said, Balaam refuses to come with us. Now here's the problem with kings. Kings are not used to hearing the word no. Powerful, arrogant people don't like to be told no. Powerful, arrogant people don't like to have their ideas challenged. And so he says, okay, and I can just imagine he's stewing over it. He's probably thinking, do I arrest him and kill him, or do I raise my price? Because if I kill him, then I definitely don't have him in my service, but now I'm kind of angry. So Balak decides to raise the offer. And he sends his men back to Balaam with even more money. Now here's where the story becomes really sort of not just a morality tale, but a warning for the future. We see that in spite of God's direct command, that Balaam's not righteous. And how do we know that? Because he lets them come back. He haggles with them. Indicating that his first refusal had more to do with his reputation and his price than it had to do with righteousness of God. I mean, again, Balaam thinks of himself not necessarily as a prophet, although he was one. He thinks of himself as a sorcerer, as a wizard. What is a sorcerer or a wizard? It's somebody who believes that they can actually control supernatural powers. So he thinks he can control the ocean. He's like the captain who says, the winds do what I want. I don't do what the winds want. And he has totally gotten it backwards. And so he's not righteous. And the view of the overall portrait of Balaam, this apparent submission, is probably to be taken as insincere. In other words, he was not righteous. That's not why he refused God. It's like he wanted to see what else they had. Despite the clear statement, despite the clear statement of both God and of the angel of the Lord, which will come later, Balaam continues to seek a way to get money and honor. He's still trying. He's starting to play the game now. Even later, when we see kind of the climax of the story, we see that he's always kind of looking for how he can get a payday out of this, and which is again fascinating. It's hard to think that there was some part of verse 12 that Balaam didn't understand. Thou shalt not go and curse my people because I've blessed them. You're not going to do this, which is fascinating because it's not that God is protecting his people from Balaam. Who is God protecting in that statement? Balaam. Yeah. It's like, do not jump into this volcano, you will not win. But Balaam still wants to go. Greed got the best of him. God's already spoken, but it's hard to turn that down, that much money. And it's likely that he wanted the money and the honor that Balak offered. And he was getting close to that price. As a matter of fact, he discovered it. The New Testament regards Balaam as one who loved gain from wrongdoing. 2 Peter 2:15. Balaam is described as one who loved gain from wrongdoing. And what Peter's doing is he's making a connection between Balaam and Judas. That Judas was a loyal disciple until he thought there was something to be gained from it. I mean, and that, now, I think other theologians have been more charitable to Judas over the years, but clearly from First Peter, Peter's willing to say, no, this was because of money. And, Peter knew him as well as anybody. So again, Balaam obeys God. So Balaam this time decides, well, I'll go take a look. They have somehow found his price. And then we get to one of the best Sunday school felt board Veggie Tales type stories we've ever get to in the Bible. Chapter 22, verse 22. But God's anger was kindled because Balaam went. Balaam set out to go curse the people of Israel, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way of his adversary. Now I love that. Don't you? God, the angel of the Lord has declared Balaam his adversary. My whole hope in life from a supernatural warfare standpoint would be to go unnoticed by the angel of the Lord. I mean, it's like, Fuller, what are you doing? Nothing. I'm just over here minding my own business. No, don't you worry about me. But no. So this is the angel of the Lord saying, I'm on you. So the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way of his adversary. Now Balaam was riding on the donkey, and his two servants were with him, and the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand. Have you ever had your dog just bark at stuff and you're wondering what's there? Why is he barking? I don't know. Maybe they had this sense or this vision that we don't have. That's not a theological statement. I'm just saying it's weird. But this donkey saw the angel of the Lord. And how do we know that? Because the Bible tells us it. The donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand. And the donkey turned aside out of the road and went into the field. Well, of course, what happens? Balaam's angry. Your donkey bolts. And so what did he do? He started beating the donkey to turn her back into the road. And then the angel of the Lord stood in the narrow path between the vineyards with a wall on either side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, so the angel has repositioned himself. The donkey's like, God was going around him. So the angel repositioned himself, and now he's right there again. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between the vineyards with a wall on either side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pushed against the wall and pressed Balaam's foot against the wall. Ow! You ever been caught in a stall between a horse and a wall? They're big. It's heavy. And when so Balaam struck her again. Then the angel of the Lord went ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn either to the right or the left. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam. She just sat down, and Balaam's anger was kindled, and he struck the donkey with his staff. He's just beating this donkey. He's beating it like a rented mule. That's an expression, I think. But he's just beating. He's angry. Why won't you? What do you do? He's not even thinking anything supernatural here. Here, the great diviner prophets are not even thinking there's a supernatural reason to it. He's just thinking this is, the donkey's just misbehaving. And so we have this angel waiting there to kill Balaam. Balaam's donkey sees the angel of the Lord, and out of loyalty, this donkey tries to get him out of this danger. And Balaam's sitting here beating him. And then after this third beating, then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey and said to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you've struck me these 3 times?" And Balaam said to the donkey, "Because you made a fool of me, I wish I had a sword in my hand, for then I would kill you." Let's take a break. Let's push the pause button right there. How weird is Balaam's supernatural world that a donkey turns around and says, "I was trying to save your neck," and he starts arguing with the donkey. I'm sorry, my dog turns around, looks at me and says, "I was trying to save you from that raccoon or squirrel or whatever it was in your yard." I'm not going to argue with Jenny. I'm going to be like, "What? Whoa, what happened? When did you start talking?" But no, there's nothing biblical to support this. But it makes me wonder, is this the first time that he and the donkey have had a conversation? I mean, it's like, and apparently this did not freak Balaam out. I mean, again, the donkey explains there's an angel out there who's ready to kill you. And that's what freaks Balaam out, not the fact that his donkey just told him this. I mean, I talk to people all the time who talk to their dogs. Yet to meet one who says that they talk back. But that's how weird Balaam's world was. So the donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your donkey on which you've ridden all your life long to this day? Is it my habit to treat you this way?" And he said, "No." Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand. And he bowed down and fell on his face. And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times?" I mean, again, we're sort of, we're going to get to the whole "you're going to curse Israel" thing, but why are you beating your donkey? Why are you beating your donkey? The Lord cares about even the little things. The angel of the Lord said, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to oppose you because your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned aside before me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely just now I would have killed you and let her live." I want you to understand, just think about the way this conversation plays out. God did not tell the donkey, bolt, turn, anything like that. God did allow the donkey to explain itself. But the sentence of death was already there. I was waiting on the path to separate your head from your body. And the only reason that I'm having this conversation with you right now is because of the loyalty of your donkey, who apparently is the more faithful prophet in this little arrangement. Because had you continued on your path, on your chosen path, I would have exacted my justice upon you because your way is perverse. So instead of beating your donkey, you ought to be thanking your donkey. And then Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I've sinned, for I did not know that you stood in the road against me. Now, therefore, if it is evil in your sight, I will turn back." Hello? Is that what it takes? God's word to you directly is not enough to tell you, do not do this? I mean, I'm sorry, how many warnings do we need? What if we actually just heard what God said and did it, as opposed to waiting for our lives to crash on the rocks of disobedience? Just about every major calamity I've had in my life, I can trace back to some self-inflicted decision. And I'm not talking about like if when my grandfather died of a heart condition or anything. I'm talking about like, when I look at the bad mistakes, when I look at the real griefs of my life, I can trace those back to a terrible decision where if I had just done the right thing, if I had just obeyed the Lord, I would not be smashed up against the rocks. I would not be pressed against the wall. I would not be standing with an angel with a flaming sword in front of me. And this, he said, but Balaam, not only, he says, well, that I'm willing to negotiate, my own integrity. What's the price of my integrity? And now I'm not willing to really listen until I realize that, this really is a real threat. What is Balaam guilty of? He's guilty of not taking God seriously. And why is that? It's because he's a sorcerer. Remember what a sorcerer is. Somebody who thinks they can manipulate God or can manipulate the divine or the supernatural. That's the problem. He thinks he's in charge. It's idolatry of self. I'm the one in charge. So So Balaam said to the Lord, I've sinned, for I did not know that you stood in the road against me. Now therefore, if it is evil in your sight, I will turn back. So we have this whole, this whole episode where God has to go to this extreme level to connect with Balaam. But aren't we often pushed to that point? So what happens? Again, the angel of the Lord said to Balaam, go with the men, but speak only the word that I tell you. And so Balaam now has a new assignment. It's like, you were hired by Balaam, or by Balak. Now you're working for me. Go with the men, but speak only the word that I tell you. So Balaam went on with the princes of Balak. So now what we see is that God is going to use Balaam for his purposes, not for Balak's purposes. And this whole episode reinforces the message that Balaam must speak only the word that God tells him. Remember, he started off kind of strong. When the men came and negotiated with him, he says, I can only do what the Lord tells me. Well, he tried to deviate from that, and the Lord said, no, you were right the first time. You're only going to do what I tell you to do. So now we see that God's going to use Balaam not to curse Israel, but to bless Israel. And that's what chapters 22 and 23 through 24 are all about. Much to Balak's frustration, Balaam comes to him and starts going through all the magical procedures of the cursing. He starts to go through. He starts to do all these things that, build altars, go to the high places, all this kind of stuff. But much to Balak's frustration, Balaam, instead of cursing Israel, is going to bless them. Thank you for whoever brought the Hershey's Kisses and put it on my Bible. Looking at verse 23. So here's what happened. So Balaam, in chapter 20, the first oracle, there are 3 oracles of Balaam. And when the Lord, and I'm in chapter 23. So Balaam said to Balak, build for me here 7 altars, and prepare for me here 7 bulls and 7 rams. And Balak did as Balaam had said. And Balak and Balaam offered on each altar a bull and a ram. And Balaam said to Balak, stand beside your burnt offering, and I will go. Perhaps the Lord will come to meet me, and whatever he shows me, I will tell you. And he went to a bare height, and God met Balaam. And Balaam said to him, I have arranged the 7 altars, and have offered on each altar a bull and a ram. And the Lord said, and the Lord put a word in Balaam's mouth and said, return to Balak, and thus you shall speak. And he returned to him, and behold, he and all the princes of Moab were standing beside his burnt offering. And listen to what Balaam says. Balaam took up his discourse and said, from Aram Balak has brought me, the king of Moab from the eastern mountains. Come, curse Jacob, come curse Israel for me, and come denounce Israel. How can I curse whom God has not cursed? And how can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? From the top of the crags I see him, from the hills I behold him. Behold a people dwelling alone and not counting itself among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number the 4th part of Israel? Let me die the death of the upright, and let my end be like his. And Balak said to Balaam, what have you done to me? I took you to curse my enemies, and behold, you have done nothing but bless them. What is it that Balaam does? Balaam gets up, and the oracle delivers is not a curse against Israel. He says, this is God's chosen people. This is a people who are blessed. The children of Jacob are not like other people. They are special of God. And Balak is saying, that's not what I paid you to say. Read the script. You're supposed to be cursing them, not affirming what their God has said about them. So let's try this again. So the second oracle. Second time. Balaam says, rise, Balak, and hear. Give ear to me, O son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. He has said, and he will not, has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and he will not fulfill it? In other words, this is going to happen whether I'm here or not, whether your armies are here or not. You are in trouble. Behold, I received a command to bless, and he is blessed, and I cannot revoke it. He has not beheld misfortune in Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel. The Lord their God is with them, and the shout of a king is among them. God brings them out of Egypt, and is for them like the horns of the wild ox. He is the horns of the wild ox. And for there is no enchantment against Jacob, no divination against Israel. Now it shall be said of Jacob and Israel, what has God wrought? Behold, a people as a lioness, it rises up, and as a lion it lifts itself. And it does not lie down until it has devoured the prey and drunk the blood of the slain. That's Balaam's second oracle. And so what's Balak's response? Do not curse them at all. It's like, I just want you to stop talking. Every time you open your mouth, Balaam, it gets worse for us. And I want you to say another thing. Well, of course, Balaam's got a whole another third oracle in him. The oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, chapter 24, beginning in verse 3. The oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down with his eyes uncovered. How lovely are you, O tents of Jacob, your encampments, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch afar, like gardens beside a river, like aloes that the Lord has planted, like cedar trees beside the waters. Water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. And his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. God brings him out of Egypt, and it is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He shall eat up the nations, his adversaries, and shall break their bones in pieces and pierce them through with his arrows. He crouched, he lay down like a lion, and like a lioness who will rouse him up. Blessed are those who bless you, and cursed are those who curse you. And I would think implied in that is, and cursed are those who pay others to curse you, which is part of the original blessing of Abraham, is it not? That those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. You know, and what's even worse is, and I need to wrap this up, but what's even worse is that, you know, Balak's saying, all right, enough's enough, you're fired. And Balaam's like, I got one more. And he does. He goes into one more oracle after that. But what's interesting is that we see in these oracles a pattern. We see, you know, God takes what was supposed to be a cursing for Israel and makes it a blessing, which I think right there, that's a preachable point right there, that God takes what others mean for evil against his people and makes them a blessing. God takes the curses and makes them blessings. But we see in these oracles, you know, in Balak's attempts to persuade Balaam, you know, there are certain repeating elements, even though there's some significant deviations. First, Balak takes Balaam to these high points, and just, you know, where they would build altars in the future. Second, 7 altars are built, and 7 bulls and 7 rams. I mean, he's following all the rules, it seems. But what we see is that, you know, what happens when we do all the religious stuff for the wrong reasons? You know, that's no longer, when you take a religious ritual and use it for your purposes, that's not a sacrifice. What do we call that? We call that magic. We call that witchcraft. What's the difference between, say, for example, religion and witchcraft? Well, basically witchcraft, magic, is ritual manipulation of the supernatural. The difference between a spell and a prayer is that in a prayer, you're honoring God, you're asking for God's help, you're pleading, you're surrendering to God. In a spell, you're trying to control God. You're trying to manipulate God. You're trying to manipulate the supernatural. So it may look like a legitimate ceremony. He's following all the rules, he's following all the procedures, but he's doing it to try and manipulate God. Third, Balaam tells Balak to stay by the altars while he goes elsewhere to meet the Lord. But on the third occasion, the Spirit of God descends on him. Fourth, Balaam pronounces a long 3-part blessing of Israel. In other words, these are God's people, and he's not going to curse them. And then, of course, Balak reacts angrily each time. But Balaam keeps reasserting that he's only doing what the Lord has told him to do. And it's fascinating that you see throughout these blessings and curses, it's not just that Balaam is blessing them in this encounter. I mean, you hear him repeating the covenant promises of Abraham. You hear him talking about the lion that's going to rise, the Lion of Judah, that's going to arise. You hear him talking about all these sort of messianic things that are going to happen. And what happens is that Balaam's prophecy is not just a prophecy for this would-be battle at Moab. It's a prophecy for the ages. Because in this prophecy, we see some of the first glimpses, some of the first indications of God's bigger plan for Israel once Israel is settled and once we start to lay the groundwork for the coming of the Messiah. So there's some really, really interesting stuff. I encourage you to go back and really study those oracles of Balaam. Because one of the metaphors that is apparent here is that, the donkey is in many ways the true prophet. And I'm not saying this to be provocative, but in many ways we also see that even truth comes from the mouth of an ass. And I'm not talking about the donkey, I'm talking about Balaam. Because Balaam was a swindler, a sorcerer, a charlatan, all these kinds. I don't know, actually he wasn't a charlatan. He seemed to have some sort of supernatural mojo or something like that. But whatever it was, he was doing it all for his own purposes. And yet God still used him. God used Balaam to make prophecies about Israel, about God's kingdom and the Messiah in a way that made it unforgettable to the enemies of Israel. And so what you see is that God can use any instrument, any mouth that he desires. I mean, again, there are so many things that we can unpack from the story of Balaam. And it's clear that throughout Scripture, they continue to reference this. They continue to unpack that. But we're just dealing with the book of Numbers today. So I'm going to release you on that. Thank you very much. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, as we study this story, we ask you to help us to remember that you call us into obedience. That even if we don't obey you or follow you willingly, even if we negotiate or make deals or things like that, you're still going to use us for your purposes. This is not an enticement, O Lord, but this ought to be a warning to us that we are not going to outmaneuver or trick you. That we, O Lord, even in our sin, will bring glory to your name. Not that we should celebrate sin, O Lord, not that we should sin that grace may abound, but Lord, through the example of your justice, you will show your greater sovereignty and your greater power. So Lord, make us humble. Make us obedient. Let us willingly and lovingly follow you so that we will find ourselves among the blessed. And we pray these things in Jesus' name.